The first woman who left because of it told me at least I wasn't boring. The second didn't say anything, just moved her things out while I was at work and left a note that said I can't do this without specifying what this was, exactly, though I had a reasonable idea. The third lasted 8 months and I genuinely thought we'd figured out a system. She wore earplugs. I recorded myself to know what I'd said. We didn't talk about it in the morning. Then one night apparently I said something specific enough that earplugs weren't the issue anymore, and that was that. 7 years ago. I've lived alone since. The thing about talking in your sleep is that you can't control it, and you can't stop it, and you can't even know what you're saying unless someone tells you, which requires there to be someone present, which requires exactly the kind of situation that caused the problem in the first place. It's a closed loop. I've made peace with it the way you make peace with things that aren't going to change, not happily, just practically. I took the Villain Station contract because the acoustic specifications were genuinely interesting and because the fee was good and because I hadn't left my apartment for anything non-essential in 4 months, which even by my standards was getting concerning. The technical brief said the conference would run 6 weeks. I packed for 8, because I always pack for longer than I need. I forgot to pack the good earplugs, remembered on the transit, decided it didn't matter since I'd be sleeping alone anyway. The housing assignment put me in the technical sector. Low ambient noise, isolated from the main residential areas, exactly what my equipment needed. I read the room assignment twice on the way there, confirmed it was correct, and thought, good, no neighbors. I was wrong about that. I found out about the neighbor on the second morning. The station's housing coordinator came to my door at 7:45 with the expression of someone who had been having a bad week and was about to make it my problem. She explained, with careful diplomatic phrasing that meant approximately none of the words she was using, that a scheduling conflict had resulted in my accommodation being adjacent to the private quarters of a senior diplomatic guest, and that the senior diplomatic guest had requested my relocation. Where would I relocate to? I said. She named 3 options. I knew all 3 rooms. I'd done the preliminary acoustic survey the day before. The first had a ventilation resonance problem that would make my monitoring equipment useless. The second was directly above the main conference hall, and would pick up ambient noise from every session. The third had a structural echo in the east wall that I'd flagged in my report as requiring remediation before the conference began. Those rooms have acoustic issues, I said. We're aware, she said. We're working on them. The conference starts in 3 days, I said. She looked at me with the expression of someone who was also aware of that. I told her I couldn't do my job from any of those rooms and that if the translations were compromised during the conference because of acoustic interference, the diplomatic consequences would be significantly worse than whatever inconvenience my presence was causing the senior diplomatic guest. I said this politely. She left without resolving anything, which I've learned means the problem is above her pay grade and she's going to pass it up the chain and hope it resolves itself. I went back to work. The technical sector had a secondary acoustic issue I noticed the previous evening. The wall between my room and the adjacent quarters had a resonance frequency that meant any significant sound in either space would bleed through. I'd been planning to address it anyway as part of the general survey. I pulled the necessary equipment and went to work on it. The adjacent quarters had a small entrance vestibule that I needed access to in order to install the absorption panels correctly. I had a technical access authorization from the station administration. I used it. I was halfway through the installation when I became aware that I was not alone. She was standing in the inner doorway. I registered several things in quick succession: the bearing, which was the kind that doesn't come from training but from a lifetime of everyone in every room adjusting to your presence; the expression, which was currently doing something that was going to be a problem for me in approximately 30 seconds, and the fact that I was in her quarters without her knowledge, installing equipment in her vestibule. Which from her perspective probably looked like exactly what it wasn't. I said, "I have a technical authorization," she said in standard that was precise enough to be a second language learned from very good teachers. "You have entered my private space without my consent. The authorization covers the technical sector and adjacent." I am aware of what the authorization covers, she said. I am telling you what it does not cover. We looked at each other. She was right, technically. The authorization covered the technical installation, not the social contract around entering someone's living space without warning. I apologize for not notifying you in advance, I said. The wall resonance affects both spaces. Without these panels, sound from your quarters will carry into the technical sector and back, including any private conversations. A pause. You're saying you can hear what happens in my quarters? Currently, yes. After the panels are installed, no. Another pause. Longer. Finish the installation, she said. And then, to someone I hadn't seen in the inner room. Stay. The guard who appeared in the doorway was not small. I finished the installation in what I estimated was record time for that type of panel configuration, collected my equipment, and left. The authorization had covered the work. The conversation had covered something else. Her name, I found out from the public conference registry that evening, was Erin. Queen Erin of the Villain Concordat, which explained the bearing and the precise standard and the guard who had appeared from nowhere. She had arrived 2 days before the official delegation, which the registry listed as a logistical preference. I looked at the note in my own file that said low ambient noise, isolated from main residential areas, and thought about how 2 people with the same requirement for quiet had ended up separated by a single wall. Then I stopped thinking about it because I had 3 days of acoustic survey work left and approximately 40 hours of functional sleep available before the conference started. The first night I slept badly, which is normal for me in new environments. The second night I slept better. I know this because I don't remember waking up, which is my metric for a good night. The third night I had a dream about something I don't fully remember, which is also normal, and apparently said things I also don't remember, which is less normal in the sense that it's normal for me but not for the situation. I didn't know about it until later. At the time I just woke up, checked my equipment, reviewed the acoustic readings from overnight, and noted that the wall panels were performing within expected parameters. No bleed-through. Both spaces acoustically isolated. That was what my equipment said. What my equipment didn't account for was that acoustic isolation works on ambient sound levels, not on sounds that occur at the specific resonance frequency of the wall itself, a frequency I'd identified during the survey and had been planning to address in the second phase of the installation, which I hadn't gotten to yet because I'd run out of the correct panel grade and the replacement materials were arriving on the same supply transport as half the diplomatic delegation. A very specific narrow frequency band, occurring naturally when a human voice hits certain notes. The notes, as it happens, that I tend to hit when I'm half asleep and talking to no one. I didn't know this yet. I was eating something from the station commissary that was technically breakfast, and reviewing the day's schedule when the formal notification came through. Queen Erin requested my presence at her convenience to discuss a technical matter. I assumed it was about the vestibule panels. I finished breakfast, checked my equipment readings one more time, and went. It was not about the vestibule panels. She was seated when I arrived, which I'd learned from 3 days of observing diplomatic interactions meant the meeting was being conducted on her terms rather than as an equal exchange. Her expression was the controlled version of something I couldn't quite read, not angry, not the confrontational look from the vestibule. Something more considered. The panels are functioning correctly, I said. If there's a resonance issue I can. The panels are fine, she said. Sit down. I sat. You talk in your sleep, she said. The room was very quiet. I'm aware, I said, after a moment that was probably too long to be casual. I apologize if it. The panels block ambient sound, she said. They do not block sound at the wall's natural resonance frequency, which your voice apparently hits. I thought about the second phase of the installation. The panel grade I'd ordered. The supply transport. I'll have it corrected as soon as the materials arrive, I said. When do they arrive? 4 days. She looked at me. The conference has already started. Yes, I said. So for 4 more days. Yes, I said. I'm sorry. If you'd prefer, I can try to arrange alternative accommodation despite the acoustic. That won't be necessary, she said. We were talking about panel installation schedules. We were also, I was beginning to understand, talking about something else entirely, though I couldn't yet identify what. Is there anything specific that was disruptive? I said carefully. That I should know about? She looked at me for a moment. No, she said. Nothing specific. She was lying. I didn't know how I knew that. I knew it anyway. I'll expedite the materials, I said. There's no urgency, she said. And something in the way she said it made me stop halfway to standing up. Okay, I said. That will be all, she said. I left. In the corridor, I stood for a moment trying to identify what had just happened and concluded that I didn't have enough information to do so accurately, and that the most useful thing I could do was get back to work. I got back to work. But I thought about it for the rest of the day, which is unusual for me. I'm good at compartmentalizing. Whatever had been in that room with us, in the careful space between what she said and what she meant, had followed me out. The replacement panels arrived on day 4, as scheduled. I installed them the same evening, full coverage of the resonance frequency band, properly graded material, no gaps in the installation. I tested the result 3 times and confirmed complete acoustic isolation between the 2 spaces. I slept worse that night than I had since arriving. I don't know why. The room was the same, the work was done, there was no logical reason for it. I lay in the dark for 2 hours before I fell asleep, and when I did I apparently said nothing, because there was nothing to carry through the wall anymore and nobody on the other side to hear it anyway. I told myself this was fine. It was fine. The conference was at its midpoint and the work had settled into a rhythm, monitoring, adjustment, the occasional urgent fix when something in the station's aging acoustic infrastructure decided to demonstrate why the original survey had flagged it. I was good at the work and the work kept me occupied, and occupied was the correct state to be in. Erin and I had not spoken since the panel conversation. I saw her at distance twice, once crossing the main concourse with her delegation, once in the corridor outside the Eastern Conference Hall. Both times she didn't see me, or appeared not to. I was developing a working theory that the whole thing had been a minor administrative inconvenience that she had already forgotten, which was the correct and sensible interpretation, and I was committed to it. Then she sent me a technical request. Formally, through the station's administrative system, with a reference number and everything. The Eastern Secondary Briefing Room had an echo problem. Could I address it at my earliest convenience? I knew that room. I'd flagged it in the preliminary survey, minor flutter echo in the upper register, caused by 2 parallel reflective surfaces about 4 meters apart. Not serious, easily fixed with a single panel placement. A 10-minute job. I went the next morning. The room was empty when I arrived and I got to work and was nearly finished when I heard the door. She came in alone, which I noted because I'd never seen her without at least one guard in any semi-official context. She looked at what I was doing with the same focused attention she'd given the vestibule installation, which I was starting to understand was just how she looked at things, completely, without the social performance of looking. Flutter echo, I said. Upper register. 1 panel, that wall. I pointed. It'll be done in a few minutes. I know, she said. I looked up the technical term. I looked at her. After you sent the request. Before, she said. She had identified the problem herself, looked up what it was called, and then submitted a formal request using the correct terminology. This was either very thorough or something else. You could have fixed it yourself, I said. The placement isn't complicated once you know what you're looking for. Yes, she said. We looked at each other. We were talking about acoustic panel placement. We were not talking about acoustic panel placement. Is there anything else in the room that needs attention? I said carefully. Not in the room, she said. I finished the installation. Tested it. The flutter echo was gone. I started packing my equipment, and was aware of her watching me do it with the same quality of attention that had been in the vestibule. Complete, not performing anything. The panels, she said. The new ones. Installed 4 days ago. Full coverage. I know, she said. I noticed. I stopped packing. Is there a problem with them? No, she said. They work correctly. A pause. That's the observation. I looked at her. She was looking at a point slightly past my left shoulder, which I noticed was what she did when she was saying something she wasn't entirely comfortable saying directly. I'll take that as a positive review, I said. You can take it however you like, she said. And then, still not quite looking at me, you sleep better when it's quieter. Your work patterns the next day are more consistent. I put down the equipment case. You've been observing my work patterns. I've been observing whether the acoustic situation was affecting the conference operations. She said. You are part of the conference operations. That's a reasonable explanation. I said. Yes, she said. It is. I picked the equipment case back up. I was almost at the door when she spoke again. Before the new panels, she said. You talked more. On the difficult nights. I stopped. Didn't turn around immediately. Took one breath. I'm aware the previous installation was inadequate. I said. I apologize for. I'm not complaining, she said. I turned around. She was looking directly at me now, which was different from the shoulder point, and her expression had the quality of someone who has decided to say something they've been not saying for a while. What did I say? I said. Specifically. Different things, she said. On different nights. But some nights more than others. She paused. You had a difficult night 8 days ago. After the delegation from the third system arrived. I remembered that day. The delegation had brought their own acoustic equipment that interfered with mine, and it had taken 6 hours to negotiate a technical compromise that everyone hated equally, which is usually the sign of a fair solution. I'd gone to bed frustrated. What did I say? I said. You said that you were tired of being in rooms full of people who were performing everything, she said. That you couldn't tell what anyone actually thought because everything was managed. That you wanted. She stopped. What did I want? I said. She looked at me for a moment. You said you wanted to talk to someone who just said the thing? Without the management. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet after you've fixed the acoustic problem, fully, cleanly, without the small reflections that remind you sound is bouncing around the space. That's embarrassing, I said. Why? She said. Because it's. I stopped. It's the kind of thing you think and don't say. You said it, she said. You just didn't know anyone was listening. We stood in the fixed room and I thought about 7 years of living alone and the specific closed loop of a problem you can't fix because fixing it requires the thing that caused it. I thought about performed rooms full of managed people. I thought about a technical request submitted with the correct terminology by someone who had looked it up before she needed it. You sent the request because you wanted to talk to someone who just said the thing, I said. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, it was precise in the way her standard always was, each word placed correctly. I sent the request, she said, because the flutter echo was genuinely irritating. And, I said. A pause. And I had been thinking about what you said. About the managed rooms. Because you're in them all the time. I said. Yes, she said. Not managed. Just yes. I picked up my equipment case. The echo is fixed, I said. If you find any other acoustic issues in rooms you use frequently, the technical request system works fine. I know, she said. I've used it. Once, I said. So far, she said. I left. In the corridor I thought about the word so far and what it was and wasn't saying, and I thought about it for the rest of the day, and that night I lay in the fully isolated room and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep well at all. In the morning my work patterns were not consistent. I noticed this and did not write it in my technical log. She sent 3 more technical requests over the following week. The first was legitimate, a low-frequency hum in the private meeting room she used for bilateral sessions, caused by a ventilation coupling that had been installed slightly off specification. I fixed it in 20 minutes. She wasn't there when I arrived and wasn't there when I left, which I told myself was completely normal and didn't mean anything either way. The second was less clearly legitimate. A room she described as having inconsistent acoustic quality turned out to have perfectly adequate acoustics by any measurable standard, the kind of room I would have marked as satisfactory in my preliminary survey without flagging anything. I checked it 3 times because I assumed I was missing something. I wasn't missing anything. I left a note in the technical log that the room was within acceptable parameters and submitted it through the system. She responded through the system the next morning with a single line, "thank you for checking." I read that several times and concluded that either she had a finely calibrated sense of when acoustic quality crossed from adequate to genuinely good, or something else was happening. I wrote within acceptable parameters in my actual work log and didn't write the other thing. The third request came on a day when the conference schedule had produced one of those rare gaps. 2 hours in the afternoon where no sessions were running and the station had the quality of a place temporarily released from its purpose. The request was for the observation lounge on the station's outer ring. Unusual acoustics due to the curved exterior wall. The observation lounge did have unusual acoustics. It also had the best view on the station. The outer ring faced away from the docking infrastructure, toward open space, and the curved wall that caused the acoustic irregularity was floor-to-ceiling transparent panel. I'd been meaning to fix the echo problem since the first week and hadn't prioritized it because no conference sessions were scheduled there. She was there when I arrived. Not working, not reviewing documents. Sitting in one of the chairs facing the viewport, looking at the space outside. She heard me come in and didn't turn around, which I was starting to read as a specific thing. She did it when she didn't want to perform the act of someone noticing you arrive. I started on the echo assessment. The curved wall created a focusing effect at certain frequencies. Not unpleasant, actually, more like the room had a specific acoustic personality rather than a problem. I moved through the space taking measurements, and after a few minutes she said, still facing the viewport, "Is it fixable?" "Technically," I said. "Whether it should be fixed is a different question." She turned then. "Explain." "The curvature focuses sound from this point." I indicated the center of the room. "Toward that point." I indicated the far wall. "If you stand here and speak at normal volume, someone standing there hears it as if you're beside them. It's a whispering gallery effect. Some people find it useful." She looked at the 2 points. "Useful how?" "Private conversation in a public space," I said. 2 people can hear each other clearly without anyone between them hearing anything. She looked at me. "You're recommending I keep the defect." "I'm noting that whether it's a defect depends on what you use the room for," I said. "We were talking about acoustic architecture." We were also talking about something that I was not going to name in a semi-public space with uncertain acoustic properties. "Leave it," she said. "Done," I said. I started packing my equipment. Outside the viewport, something large and slow was moving through the transit lanes, a cargo transport, probably, the kind that drifted rather than flew. I watched it for a moment because it was easier than the alternative. "You haven't been sleeping," she said. I stopped. "My work patterns have been. You told me 7 days ago that you wanted to talk to someone who just said the thing," she said. "I'm saying the thing. You haven't been sleeping. Your response times in the technical logs are slower in the mornings. You look like someone who is lying awake." I turned around. She was watching me with the direct quality that I'd spent 3 weeks learning to read, not evaluating, not performing observation. Just looking. "The new panels work," I said. "The room is quiet." "I know," she said. That's what I'm saying. I sat down. Not because I'd decided to. I just found myself sitting, in the chair beside hers, both of us facing the viewport where the cargo transport was still making its slow way through the transit lane. I've slept alone for 7 years, I said. Because of the talking. It was the practical solution. And now the room is quiet, she said. And now the room is quiet, I said. And I can't sleep. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the transport had cleared the viewport. Clean space now, the kind that goes on until it doesn't. Before the panels, she said. The difficult nights. You talked more. I know, I said. I'm sorry. I'm not, she said. I looked at her. The things you said, she continued carefully, placing each word. On the difficult nights. You said things you wouldn't say if you knew anyone was listening. That's how it works, I said. I don't know what I'm saying. I know, she said. That's what made them. She stopped. What? I said. She looked at the viewport. Everyone who speaks to me manages what they say. Before they say it. They consider what it means for them, for their position, for what I might think. Every word is placed. That sounds exhausting, I said. You have no idea, she said. And then, quieter. You didn't do that. Because you didn't know you were speaking. I thought about what I say when I'm asleep. I don't know most of it. The third woman had told me some of it, once, and I'd spent a week trying not to think about it. The things that come out when there's no filter are not always things you choose to say. What did I say? I said. On the worst nights. She looked at me for a long moment. You said her name, she said. Once. The room was very quiet. The whispering gallery effect meant that anything said at the center of the room traveled to the far wall and back, but we were both sitting off-center, and the space between us was just space. Whose name? I said, even though I knew. She didn't answer. She looked back at the viewport. I sat with it. The cargo transport was long gone. Another ship was moving through the lane now, smaller, faster, going somewhere specific. I didn't know, I said. I know you didn't, she said. That's... I stopped. Started again. How long? 3 weeks, she said. Before the panels. 3 weeks of nights. I thought about what 3 weeks of unfiltered sleep talking might contain and felt something that wasn't quite embarrassment, more like the specific vulnerability of having been seen doing something private, except I hadn't been doing it, I'd been asleep, and the distinction felt important and also completely irrelevant. I should have fixed the panel sooner, I said. Yes, she said. You should have. We sat in the observation lounge with its unfixed acoustic personality, and its viewport full of transit lanes, and I thought about 7 years of practical solutions and empty rooms and a specific closed loop that apparently had more exits than I'd accounted for. I'm going to sleep badly again tonight, I said. Probably, she said. That's not helpful, I said. No, she said. But it's true. Outside, the smaller ship had cleared the viewport. For a moment there was nothing in the frame at all. Just the uninterrupted dark, clean and very quiet, going on until it didn't. I did sleep badly that night. And the night after. The room was perfectly quiet, and I lay in it, and stared at the ceiling and thought about 3 weeks of unfiltered nights and a name I'd apparently said out loud without knowing it, and the specific quality of how she looked at the viewport after she said it, and I got approximately 5 hours of sleep across 2 nights, which is not a foundation for good decision-making. The work helped. It always helps. The conference was in its final stretch, and there were enough small acoustic emergencies to keep me occupied. A feedback issue in the main hall that took 4 hours to trace to a faulty connection in the translation relay system, a humidity problem in one of the smaller rooms that was affecting the panel performance, the general entropy of a station that had been asked to host more people than it was designed for. I fixed things. It was concrete and measurable, and the opposite of lying awake thinking about something I couldn't fix with a panel and a calibration tool. She sent no technical requests for 3 days. I noticed the absence the way I'd noticed it before and told myself the same things I'd told myself before, with approximately the same success rate. On the 4th day, the sabotage happened. I was in the monitoring room when the readings changed, not gradually, not the slow drift of a system under load, but a sharp specific shift that meant something had been introduced into the translation relay. Someone had inserted a signal modulator into the secondary distribution node, the kind of device that introduces subtle frequency shifts into audio transmission. Small enough that automated systems wouldn't flag it. Large enough that over the course of a session, certain phonemes would shift, not into noise, but into different phonemes. Words would change. Not randomly. The frequency profile of the modulator was targeted at the specific phonetic range that distinguished several key diplomatic terms in the third delegation's language from terms with opposite meanings. It wasn't a technical failure. It was designed. I had approximately 4 minutes before the afternoon session started and the modulated translation reached the delegates. I pulled up the distribution schematic. The secondary node was in the technical infrastructure level, sub-basement, accessible through a maintenance corridor that wasn't on the standard station map but that I'd surveyed in the first week because I survey everything. The problem was that the maintenance corridor required a clearance code I didn't have, because it ran through the private diplomatic quarters section of the infrastructure, and my authorization covered the conference spaces but not the residential infrastructure. I sent an emergency flag through the administrative system and got an automated acknowledgement that my request would be reviewed within 2 business hours. 2 business hours. I called Paris, the station's senior diplomatic liaison who had been my point of contact for administrative issues, and got his assistant, who told me he was in a pre-session briefing and unavailable. 3 minutes. I did the only thing I could think of and sent a direct message to the one person I knew who had full access to every part of the station's infrastructure, and who I had a reason to contact. *Emergency. Translation relay compromised. Need access to maintenance corridor 7C immediately. Conference session starts in 3 minutes. The response came in 40 seconds, coming. She arrived in the monitoring room in 90 seconds, which meant she had been moving before she finished reading the message. No guard. She took one look at my screen and said, "Show me," and I showed her and she understood it immediately, not the technical detail, but the structure of it, what it meant, and what it would do. "The session," she said. 3 minutes, I said. 2 now. "This way," she said. We went. She knew the station's infrastructure the way someone knows a place they've studied rather than lived in, not instinctive, but complete, every junction remembered and applied correctly. She moved fast and I kept up, and she didn't waste time explaining anything she didn't need to explain. The maintenance corridor was behind a panel in a sub-basement junction that I would never have found without her. She entered a code and it opened, and we went in, and I had my equipment out and running before the panel closed behind us. The modulator was exactly where the schematic said it would be. A small device, professional grade, installed with enough care that you'd miss it if you weren't looking. I was looking. I pulled it in 40 seconds. "Done," I said. She had her communicator out. "Delay the session start by 5 minutes," she said to whoever answered. "Technical verification required." She closed the connection. We were in the maintenance corridor, which was narrow enough that standing next to each other was the only spatial option. The station's infrastructure hummed around us, ventilation, power routing, the background noise of a large structure doing what it did. My equipment was still running, checking that the relay had returned to clean signal. "Clean," I said. "Full restoration." She looked at the device in my hand. "Someone installed this deliberately." "Yes." Targeted frequency shift. Specific phoneme range. Which delegation? Third system. The terminology shift would have affected their word for agreement, and their word for concession. Same phonemes, opposite meanings. She was quiet for a moment, working through the implications. I watched her do it, the stillness of someone processing something quickly and completely. The second session yesterday, she said. The third delegation was unusually resistant to a proposal they previously indicated support for. The modulator may have been in place longer than today, I said. I need to review the session recordings. I'll get you access, she said. We were in the maintenance corridor, very close together because of the space, and she was looking at the modulator in my hand with the expression of someone who has just had a clear picture of something that had been blurry. You sent me the message, she said. Not you sent the station emergency system or * you contacted the liaison office. * me. You have full infrastructure access, I said. And you respond in 40 seconds. How did you know I'd respond quickly? I thought about the technical requests. The Flutter Echo, that wasn't a problem. The observation lounge. * so far. *. I didn't know, I said. I made a calculation. What calculation? I looked at the modulator. Then at her, which was easier than it should have been given the context. That you pay attention to things, I said. And that you act on what you notice. She held my gaze for a moment. You could have sent the message to anyone, she said. I sent it to the person most likely to help, I said. That's a practical answer, she said. Yes, I said. Is it the whole answer? She said. The maintenance corridor hummed around us. My equipment confirmed clean signal for the third time. Outside, in the conference spaces, 5 minutes of delay were running down. No, I said. It's not the whole answer. She didn't ask what the rest of it was. She looked at me for a moment in the narrow corridor with the station's infrastructure making its constant background sound, and then she said, The session will start in 2 minutes. I know, I said. We should go back. Yes, I said. Neither of us moved for a moment that was longer than necessary. Then we went back. She walked ahead through the junctions she'd memorized and I followed, and we emerged from the sub-basement into the main corridor and separated without discussing it, her toward the conference hall, me toward the monitoring room. I watched the session from the monitoring room. The translation relay ran clean. The third delegation, hearing what was actually being said for the first time in what might have been days, shifted their position in the second hour of the session in a way that the diplomatic observers noted as significant. I wrote my technical report. I documented the modulator, the frequency profile, the recovery procedure. I wrote it carefully and completely and said nothing in it about maintenance corridors or 40-second response times or moments that lasted longer than necessary. Some things go in the technical log. Some things don't. That night I slept for 7 hours without waking up. I don't know what I said. There was no one on the other side of the wall to hear it. I thought about that more than I probably should have. The investigation into the modulator took 3 days and produced a result that satisfied everyone officially, and nobody privately. The device had been installed by a station maintenance technician who had since departed on scheduled rotation. The technician had been contracted through a third-party staffing agency. The agency had connections to a commercial interest that stood to benefit from the breakdown of the third delegation's negotiations. The chain was documented, the responsible parties identified, the appropriate diplomatic notification sent. The conference security protocols were updated. The matter was considered resolved. I wrote my portion of the technical report and submitted it, and attended one meeting where I explained the acoustic mechanics of the frequency modulation to a room of people who needed to understand it for the record and didn't need to understand it technically. I explained it clearly and answered the questions and left. Erin attended that meeting. She sat across the table and asked 2 questions, both precise, both aimed at aspects of the report that the other attendees hadn't flagged. I answered them directly. She nodded. We did not look at each other for longer than the conversation required. Afterward, in the corridor, she fell into step beside me. Not arranged, she was simply moving in the same direction, and the timing worked out that way. Or something like that. The third delegation, she said. Their position changed yesterday. I saw it in the monitoring feed, I said. The proposal they agreed to, they'd been resisting it for a week. The resistance was being used as leverage by 2 other delegations to extract concessions elsewhere. She paused. When the resistance dissolved, the leverage dissolved with it. That's a significant shift, I said. 2 weeks of negotiation restructured in an afternoon, she said. Because the translation was suddenly accurate. I thought about the modulator and its targeted frequency range. Someone had planned the distortion carefully. The dissolution of it had unplanned consequences, better ones than the planners had intended. The conference ends in 5 days, she said. I know, I said. Your contract runs to the end of the conference. Yes. We walked. The corridor connected the meeting rooms to the main concourse and was usually busy with diplomatic traffic. Today it was relatively clear. The schedule had most of the delegations in closed sessions until the evening. After the conference, she said. What do you do? Go home, I said. Process the acoustic data. Write the final report. Take the next contract. Where? Wherever the next contract is, I said. I don't usually have a strong preference for location. You've been doing this for how long? 11 years. I said. Alone, she said. It wasn't a question. I answered it anyway. Yes, I said. We reached the point where the corridor split, one direction toward the main concourse, the other toward the technical sector and the private quarters beyond it. The natural end of the shared path. The observation lounge, she said. This evening. If you're not working. We were talking about a location and a time. We were also talking about something else, and we both knew it, and neither of us named it. I'm not working this evening, I said. 7th hour, she said, and walked toward the concourse without waiting for confirmation. I went back to the technical sector and tried to work for the rest of the afternoon with inconsistent success. The monitoring equipment showed all systems running clean. There was nothing to fix. I found this more difficult than having something to fix. She was already there when I arrived at the observation lounge. Same chair as before, facing the viewport. The transit lanes outside were quieter in the evening, fewer cargo movements, more of the long-haul vessels that traveled at night by preference. I sat in the chair beside hers. The room's acoustic personality did what it did, that slight focusing effect at the center, the specific quality of the space. 5 days, she said. Yes, I said. I've been thinking about something, she said. Since the corridor. The maintenance corridor. What specifically? I said. You said you sent me the message because I pay attention to things and act on what I notice. She paused. I've been thinking about whether that's accurate. It seemed accurate at the time, I said. It is, she said. But it's also incomplete. As a description. I looked at her. She was looking at the viewport. What's the complete description? I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been paying attention to things for a long time. It's necessary. You notice things because the information matters. Who is shifting position, who is managing what, where the pressure points are. It's a function. Yes, I said. Paying attention to you, she said, is not a function. The room was quiet. Outside, a long-haul vessel moved through the far transit lane, slow and deliberate. I don't know what to do with that, I said honestly. Neither do I, she said. That's what I've been thinking about. We sat with that for a moment. The viewport held its view, the dark and the distant traffic and the specific quality of space that doesn't end. The things I said, when I was asleep. Before the panels. Yes. You said I said her name once? Your name. Yes. What else? I said. You've been careful not to tell me specifics. What else did I say? She was quiet long enough that I started thinking she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, still facing the viewport. You talked about being tired of empty rooms, she said. Several times. Different ways. Sometimes it was about the work, the spaces you move through. Sometimes it was. She stopped. Sometimes it was what? I said. Sometimes it was about something that had been empty for a long time, she said. And whether it was ever going to be something else. I thought about 7 years. About practical solutions and closed loops. About the things you think before you sleep that come out as words you don't know you're saying. That's embarrassing, I said. You said that before, she said. About something else I told you. It keeps being true, I said. I know, she said. But it isn't. She paused. Embarrassing implies it was wrong to say. Or wrong to feel. It wasn't. Another pause. It was the only thing I heard in 6 weeks that I believed completely. Because there was no reason to manage it. I looked at her profile, the way she was watching the viewport, the careful stillness that I'd spent weeks learning to read. You believe things more when there's no reason to perform them, I said. Everything I'm told, she said, is told to me for a reason. People speak to me knowing I'm listening. Knowing what I am. The words are always. She made a small gesture. Placed. And I wasn't placing them. I said. You were asleep, she said. I was asleep. I agreed. The long-haul vessel had cleared the viewport. The transit lane was empty for a moment, just the dark and the distant pinpoints that were too far away to move visibly. 5 days, I said. Yes, she said. And after 5 days you go back to my responsibilities, she said. Yes. And I go back to the next contract, I said. Yes. We sat in the observation lounge with its unfixed acoustic personality, and I thought about what it means when two people sit in a room together and say true things to each other, and neither of them is managing anything. I don't know what the next contract is yet, I said. I usually book ahead. I haven't. She looked at me then. Not the viewport. Me. That's unlike you, she said. Based on what I know of your work patterns. Yes, I said. It is. She held my gaze for a moment that was longer than looking requires. The observation lounge, she said. Tomorrow. Same time. Yes, I said. And the day after, she said. Yes, I said. And the day after that, she said. Until there are no days left. Yes, I said. Until then. Outside, new traffic was entering the transit lane. Slow, deliberate, going somewhere specific. The room held us in its particular acoustic quiet, and neither of us moved to leave, and the 5 days felt like both too many and not nearly enough, which is a specific kind of problem I hadn't had before and didn't know the technical solution to. I sat with it anyway. It seemed like the right thing to do. The conference ended on a Thursday. I know this because I wrote it in my technical log, * conference concluded. All acoustic systems performing within parameters. Contract complete. * clean and factual, the way technical logs are supposed to be. I packed my equipment over 2 hours, which is faster than usual. I work slowly when I'm comfortable somewhere and quickly when I'm not, and I couldn't determine which this was, so I split the difference and packed at medium speed, and that took 2 hours. She came when I had 1 case left. No guard. She stood in the doorway of the technical sector room and looked at the packed cases and didn't say anything for a moment. The relay system will need recalibration in about 4 months, I said. I left notes in the technical file. Whoever they bring in should be able to follow them. I'll make sure they have the file, she said. We were talking about maintenance schedules. We were also saying goodbye, and neither of us was saying that. The observation lounge, I said. The acoustic personality. I left it. I know, she said. I checked. I picked up the last case. Put it down again. You said the things I told you when I was asleep were the only things you believed completely. I said. Because there was no reason to manage them. Yes, she said. I want to tell you something now. I said. Awake. That I would have said then. That I'd been thinking before I sleep for longer than I've known you were listening. She didn't move. Her expression was the direct version, no management, no placement. I told her. She stood in the doorway for a moment after. Then she crossed the room and she didn't say anything, she just put her hand against my face the way you touch something you've been careful not to touch, and I understood that she had been answering me for months through a wall. I picked up the last case. I haven't booked the next contract, I said. I know, she said. I checked that too. The door was still open. The cases were packed. Everything was exactly as uncertain as it had been 5 minutes ago, except that we were both standing in it together. That was enough. For now.